are ready to start, let me just deal with my... It's a good afternoon once again. My name is Jocelyn, and this is the Asake Film Festival, bringing you the public lectures. For the rest of this week, we've been giving you different lectures on Gukurahundi mainly, and the 1980 to 87 genocide period. And I would say it has been wonderful because we've been managing to do it without any challenges. And I hope we are going to continue to have our last session today without any major challenges. So it's just a rule and a precaution. If I'm kicked out of whether by internet, whether it's sabotage or it's just something happens, the guest should continue presenting because I've already made her the co-host. So I might come out, but the session will continue. So we live in a country where Zesa can go anytime, internet can be switched off anytime. But we thank God we've been able to do it without any problem. It's only yesterday when we concluded our talk, the electricity went off. So without wasting time, our guest today is Professor Jocelyn Alexander, and she will be talking about, I'm feeling guilty now to talk about the dissident perspective after the talk by Vincent Hillary yesterday. And I would say, yeah, we've been guilty for the terminology, and it's quite interesting that he raised the issue yesterday. That's their survivors, and yeah, it's a learning curve. I guess now start saying dissidents in courts, but Professor Alexander is going to give us a talk on the dissidents perspective because she has written extensively about the issue. So I don't want to waste her time. She's going to present for about 45 minutes or so. Then after that, we're going to have discussions and questions. If you have your question, you can just write it on chat, then we'll take them up. For those who are joining us on Facebook and YouTube, you can also type your questions on Facebook and YouTube. We'll also try and look at those. And after that, we are going to, all the lectures that we have done, we're going to cut them into shorter video clips that are going to be circulated on WhatsApp for the greater audience. And to everyone who has attended and who have followed up, thank you very much. Like Donald Trump will say, the numbers are going through the roof. I know they are rising every day, and we are more than excited. So Alexander, is over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zenzele. I have to thank you, first off, for the invitation to speak here. It's really an honor, and it's an honor to follow such a great lineup of speakers that we've heard from already. And I also want to just thank Cite for hosting this event as a whole. You know, it's been a powerful week of film lectures and discussion, and I know it's going on tomorrow as well. And it's really pressed us to think about what it is we are to do with violent histories that live on in the present. One of the messages I've taken away is the importance of combining rigorous documentation with imaginative forms of memorialization, so as to both create the possibility of future accountability, as well as to give meaning to the past. I think both of those things are essential, and both of them require public forums such as this one, where it's possible to meet collectively and debate the content of the stories that need to be told. It's also, extraordinarily difficult work to do, and it seems it is never done. So I commend you for taking it on. Zenzele has asked me to speak about dissident perspectives, and I take the term dissident here to mean both the label that was used in 1980s Zimbabwe in a whole variety of ways, and the position that is critical of power. So I very much take Vincent and Lova's point made yesterday about the weighty baggage of the term dissident and how careful we need to be with the way in which we use it. So this is a topic, I'm going to tell you a little personal history first. This is a topic on which I first worked several decades ago now, in the mid-1990s, when I was part of a team of researchers, including Joanne McGregor and Terence Ranger. And I continue to work closely with Joanne McGregor on related histories. We were then researching a book published as Violence and Memory in 2000 about what was once known as the Shangani Reserve, now in Kai and Lupani districts, over a 100-year period from the 1890s to the 1990s. In researching the liberation struggle part of this history, we worked closely with the Mafela Trust. I think everyone is probably familiar with it. It was made up of a group of Zipra veterans, which had already begun at that time to compile lists of the war dead, published in Parade magazine, and to seek means of memorialization. There was very little written about Zipra history at that time, and for Zipra veterans we worked with, the history of the 70s couldn't be easily separated from the violence that followed after 1980. It had affected them in profound ways. I mean, really no one was untouched by it. And at that time, that history had barely entered into public discussion. This was, of course, still a few years before the landmark publication of Breaking the Silence, which would profoundly change the debate about Gukurahundi. Though I should note for you, Zanzeli, that I think the first published reports on the 1985 Silabella disappearances, which were then referred to as the Silabella Nine, appeared in Parade and Horizon in 1992 and 1993. So it's important to remind ourselves just how long the process of trying to record, trying to remember, trying to memorialize has been underway. That's near enough 30 years ago now. So at that time, in the mid-90s, I was based in Kai and happened to be staying not far from an agricultural cooperative made up largely of former Zipra, quote unquote, dissidents, who had turned themselves in under the presidential amnesty in 1988. They were a controversial presence among local people, as well as for my Mafela Trust co-researcher, Nicholas Nkomo. Nicholas was the former commander of Zipra's Northern Front 2, in which Nkai fell, and he had been a commander also at the Ntambani assembly point and had spent much of the 1980s in Chikarubi, having been charged with and of course acquitted of treason, along with Lookout Masuku, Demiso Debengwa, and others. And he didn't have a great deal of sympathy for our dissident neighbors, taking a line that we often heard in Zapu and Zipra circles, which held more or less that the dissidents were undisciplined elements within Zipra who had given ZANU-PF an excuse to crush Zapu and had themselves added to the abuses suffered by civilians. Why fight this second futile war, Nicholas asked, when no good could come of it? And that's really the question that we set out trying to answer in the mid-90s. Why would you do that? Why would you fight this second war? An important ethic of our research, and one which Mafela was entirely supportive of, was that we wanted to explore stories that hadn't been heard and that were hard to tell. And we agreed that people who had been labeled as dissidents had not been allowed to represent themselves. And so we decided to try to interview those who were gathered on not just the cooperative in Nkai, but also two others, one in Plumtree and the other in Escardini. Nicholas was, of course, essential to this work because he was able to build trust as a result of a shared Zipra past in a way that allowed us to gain real insights into what had made these Zipra soldiers take up arms again. And this work formed the basis of an article published in 1998. So I want to present some of the findings of that work, but also to add to it with the benefit of subsequent research and with the goals of this film festival in mind. So the history of dissidents is a minefield. There are really few figures in Zimbabwean politics that have been as elusive and as controversial. Perhaps we can all agree that dissidents were a product of the violent transition from armed struggle to independent nation. But beyond that, they have been cast in wholly contradictory ways over the past decades, often in aid of partisan narratives. So depending on one's political position, they may be cast as the cause of Gukurahundi or as its effect. They may be cast as traitors or as the people who have been betrayed. They may be cast as victims or as perpetrators. They may be seen as agents of the state or as its enemy, as figments of the government's imagination, or as a category that came to encompass an entire political party and monolithic ethnicity, that is, all of ZAPU and all of the Ndebele. So these binaries, these stark oppositions are important because they help us to understand the politics of representing and making useful, that is, politically useful, the category of dissident. But these binaries also act to distort this history. So the men we interviewed revealed a far more complex history that needs to be grappled with if it is to act as a foundation for accountability and memorialization. So my focus is on the views of the former ZIPRA soldiers who took up arms again. But part of the murkiness of this history lies in the fact that there were other categories of armed and unarmed actors that claimed or were given the label dissident. So a number of people have pointed this out, as indeed did Zanzele's Silabella film. These groups included untrained young men in Matabeleland and Midlands who were fleeing state persecution and who sometimes linked up with ZIPRA soldiers. It included people who exploited the chaos of the early 80s for criminal purposes. Some few of those were also ZIPRA. And importantly, it included pseudo-dissidents. These are government agents posing as dissidents who sought to entrap civilians and who carried out atrocities to discredit ZIPRA dissidents and to justify further state repression. Pseudo operations were, of course, a strategy revived from Rhodesian wartime practices and indeed were carried out by some of the very same people. There was also a group called Super ZAPU that included some ZIPRA men, along with others who were recruited by South Africa, as a means to destabilize Zimbabwe and specifically to deter support for the ANC's armed wing, with whom ZAPU had a long-standing alliance that had extended in what we now know were really substantial ways into the 80s. And that's one of the pieces of the puzzle of Gukurahundi, which has come more clearly to light and is really important. So my point is that there were these other categories and ZIPRA soldiers who took up arms again crossed into them at times. But I'll argue that the bulk of ZIPRA soldiers actually worked to distinguish themselves from all of these groups. So what is the history of ZIPRA dissidents in their own words? What did this period look like from their view? In much of what I'm going to say, and I've said this to Vincent already, I'm going to be riding on his coattails. So apologies for some repetition here, but I'm going to try and add some new elements too. So the first point I want to make is that we need to acknowledge the tremendous distrust and vulnerability in the ceasefire moment in December 1979. There was not only the obvious division between the liberation movements and the Rhodesian security forces, but there was also deep distrust between ZIPRA and ZANLA, and also within ZIPRA and within ZANLA. The divisions between ZIPRA and ZANLA are explored in new and long-standing work by Miles Tendi, Gerald Mazarire, and Ngwabi Bebe. Tendi has emphasized the stereotyping of ZAPU and ZIPRA by ZANLA commissars who took charge of the political education of the thousands of young people who flooded across Mozambique's borders into ZANU's camps. In the final years of the war, this education depicted ZANLA as bearing the brunt of the fighting within Rhodesia, while ZIPRA barely contributed to the war effort and withheld heavily armed, conventionally trained troops outside the country with the intention of sweeping in to steal victory from ZANU and then to undermine the revolution. This narrative would be repeated again and again in the 1980s, And we actually heard a version of it in the exchange between Mugabe and Colin Shortis, the BMAT commander, in March 1983, in Tim Scarnecchia's talk on Wednesday. But it was absolutely pervasive to make this set of claims. Stories told in Zebra camps, on the other hand, depicted Zanla as a barely trained, chaotic rabble with a leadership that could not be trusted. These stories built on the attacks on Zebra of the Zipa period at Mgagao and in Mozambique, and they highlighted the Zanla practice of the Pungwi as evidence of both Zanla's willingness to needlessly risk civilian lives and its pervasive use of violence as a means of mobilization. Neither side believed the other to be trustworthy or well-intentioned, beliefs that were reinforced in clashes between the two armies inside Rhodesia. These stereotypes, these political stories, promoted hostility that was not restricted to an elite or political level, but ran right through the ranks of armed men and women and were also communicated to party supporters. Also important in understanding questions of trust are the divisions within Zebra towards the end of the war. In pointing these out, I am not suggesting Zebra was unusual. Not at all. Every one of Southern Africa's liberation armies suffered internal tensions expressed most visibly in periodic mutiny, but in fact always bubbling away. Divisions might build on social, personal, or political differences or on abuses of power. In the camps, above all, they were fed by rampant rumor and, of course, the very real infiltrations and attacks by Rhodesians. For ZAPU, the last few years of the war had also seen Zebra expand and diversify at an extraordinary rate, alongside the implementation of a new military strategy. In that context, Zebra soldiers described tensions between cohorts who were trained and armed differently and who understood themselves as soldiers in distinct ways. And one notable contrast, and I'm very much simplifying here, was between cadres who saw themselves as political soldiers with the right to contest bad orders, injustice, or ill treatment as they saw it, and those who saw themselves as regular or conventional soldiers bound by a more rigid hierarchy and who often also had a belief in their own military superiority. So there were periodic rebellions in the camps in Zambia for these and many other reasons. And the High Command also lost contact with some units inside Rhodesia who no longer trusted it. These divisions did not, I should emphasize, stand in the way of the substantial military successes of 1978-79, which forced negotiation and led to the agreement reached at Lancaster House. But they did shape the reaction to the transition and played into the creation of the first group of Zebra soldiers who would be labeled dissidents. This group distrusted the ceasefire and objected to the political concessions of Lancaster House. Some of them believed that the revolutionary goals they had been fighting for could not be achieved short of military victory. The ceasefire agreement required Zanla and Zebra to gather in designated assembly points in rural areas according to an extraordinarily tight schedule. Within just 7 days of the ceasefire, later extended to 10, despite the huge difficulties of communication and the long distances many had to travel. Field commanders had not been consulted about any of this, and they faced fierce resistance from their soldiers. Many Zebra soldiers described their utter disbelief that they were being asked to render themselves vulnerable in this way, and that they were to be policed by Rhodesian security forces while doing so. It's not surprising that some delayed coming in, some refused to come in, and some simply went to their rural home, to Bulawayo or even South Africa, and some hid weapons. In the assembly points, the divisions of earlier years within Zebra also bubbled away, causing fights and ructions, while Rhodesian forces harassed, attacked, and killed Zebra cadres outside of assembly points. It was in this context that 2 large groups of Zebra soldiers refused to come in at all, owing to a combination of distrust of Zebra commanders and a conviction that the ceasefire was a sellout. Hundreds of them would be brought in by Zebra regular forces, conventionally trained units, in May and June 1980, and imprisoned in Kami. And I cannot recommend more highly reading Vincent Ndlovu's account of this episode, which I think is by far the most detailed and interesting. But I'm now jumping ahead a bit. It's important to note that in most accounts of 1980, and despite the fraught conditions I have described, Ypres soldiers were judged to be far better disciplined than their Zanla counterparts. Zanla stood accused of campaigning extensively outside assembly points in the run-up to the February elections, and they were responsible for numerous incidents of criminal activity, for ambushing vehicles, and even for several attacks on police stations. Both Ypres and Zanla cadres were initially labeled bandits, outlaws, and renegades by politicians and in the press. But the public discourse changed following ZANU-PF's electoral victory, and notably with the opening of the new parliament. Senior politicians, including, of course, Mugabe and Ino Sankala, began to attribute a political and ethnic motive to disorder associated with Ypres. This shift can be traced in political speeches amply recorded in the Herald, Chronicle, and Hansard. And it's the origin of the term dissident, which was increasingly applied exclusively to Ypres, and which linked their actions to a refusal to accept ZANU-PF's victory and the sovereignty of the new government. These charges were repeatedly, heatedly denied by Joshua and Como and others. This is the context in which we need to place ZAPU's use of Ypres regular soldiers to imprison those Ypres men who had refused to enter APs in May and June 1980. This act was a really dramatic demonstration of commitment on the part of ZAPU's senior leadership to the election results, to the rule of law, and to a politics in which armed action was no longer deemed acceptable. It was, of course, to be ignored. Before I carry on, I want to pause for a moment to note that ZANU-PF's creation of the dissident in this moment, as both Ypres and Ndebele, required some hard work. First, the disorder still being created by Zanla had to be placed in some other category, somehow rendered not a threat to the government's sovereignty. That was a kind of sleight of hand. Second, ZAPU and Ypres had to be made Ndebele. As is regularly pointed out, there were always many Shona speakers among ZAPU's senior leadership. ZAPU also had support and committee structures across Shona-speaking areas into the 70s, though these had come under immense pressure and often been violently displaced as Zanla's rural operational areas expanded. Less frequently pointed out is that Ypres was also ethnically mixed and operated in Mashonaland in the 60s and the 70s. Recruitment in the 60s had drawn from two main sources, ZAPU's countrywide underground and the Zimbabwean population in Zambia, both of which were ethnically diverse, though a significant proportion of ZAPU's Shona speakers in exile would join Felizi and ZANU in the early 70s crisis. In the last years of the war, Ypres had operated extensively in and recruited from Mashonaland West. This was Ypres' key strategic front at the end of the war. So this whole history had to be erased as part of ZANU-PF's process of making the category of dissident synonymous with Ndebele. And I think Vincent put it very well yesterday when he said that ZAPU and Ypres had to be forced into a corner, and that corner was Matabeleland. It's a topic really for another day, but one of the unwritten histories of this time is the fate of ZAPU supporters outside Matabeleland in the Midlands, and the fate of Ypres' rank and file Shona-speaking soldiers who are, are excluded from almost all histories. Okay, so that I would say is the first iteration of the category of the dissident. The second and more lasting context that produced dissidents rapidly followed in late 1980 and early 81. This built on the high levels of distrust that already existed, but its immediate impetus lay in first the movement of Ypres and Zanla to urban cantonments in Intimbani and Chitungwiza, and second, the process of integrating the three antagonists of the liberation struggle in a new national army. The two conflagrations at Intimbani have been written about quite extensively, Chitungwiza hardly at all. I can't revisit these events in any detail here, but I want to emphasize that a key factor in the first round of conflicts in both cities was the close interaction of armed men with civilian supporters who were themselves engaged in violent conflicts, in part owing to highly provocative, rallies and speeches made by politicians. By far, the most notorious was Enos Nkala's White City Stadium rally, which sparked off the first Ntombani. Rumors ran rampant in the aftermath of this clash, and ZANU-PF's actions only fed ZIPRA's fears. Among other things, the government arrested 9 ZAPU officials, conducted a search of Nkoma's Mguza farm, and moved hundreds more ZANLA cadres to Ntombani. The second Ntombani was also kicked off by an external impetus. This time, the conflicts had integrated ZNA battalions in February 1981 in Ntombazinduna, Connemara, and Glenville. So what was behind those ZNA conflicts? ZIPRA accounts note that they were sparked off by relatively minor incidents like arguments, fistfights, rumors of food being poisoned, punishments that were deemed unjust, but then escalated rapidly, always fed by the pre-existing derogatory narratives about each army and a pervasive language of difference. Machua Chua versus Opasi, Dumbo Guru versus Four Eyes, and so on. At Ntombani, renewed fighting led ZIPRA soldiers at Gwai and Essex Vale to head for the city, only to be stopped by still intact Rhodesian Army and Air Force units, and then the interventions of senior military figures. ZANU-PF publicly blamed ZAPU and demoted Joshua Nkomo, but suppressed the findings of an official commission of inquiry. And there's actually some interesting reporting in the Chronicle of testimony to the Dumuchena commission, and it obviously wasn't, it wasn't producing the narrative that ZANU-PF wanted. So over the next 12 months, tensions built. ZANU-PF announced the arrival of the North Korean trainers of the 5th Brigade in August 1981, and that the brigade had been commissioned in October 1980, with the warning that it was intended to, quote, wipe out dissidents and criminals, including, quote, those in the army. In February 1982, just after the completion of the demobilizing and disarming of ZIPRA men, which of course made it impossible for ZIPRA as such to defend itself, the ZANU-PF government announced it had discovered vast quantities of arms on ZAPU properties and around ZIPRA assembly points, though, and I think many people have now made this point, the existence of these arms had been openly discussed between commanders of ZIPRA and ZANLA. It was hardly a discovery. So this was the pretext for the accusation that ZAPU had always been planning a coup and that it had been holding back forces and weapons to overthrow ZANU-PF. This narrative was, as I've emphasized already, familiar, and that rendered it plausible to members of ZANLA and ZANU. There are many forces that contributed to the growing conflict at this point, and I want to focus on the one that the ZIPRA men we talked to claimed as the most important, which is their persecution in and outside the ZNA in the aftermath of the arms caches saga. They do not credit the political rift itself as the source of mass desertions, but rather the direct threats to their lives. Within the ZNA, ZIPRA soldiers were, they say, labeled as dissidents, dissident sympathizers, or disloyal elements, and purged or worse with great ferocity. ZIPRA soldiers who would take up arms again, and many who did not, tell consistent stories of themselves and others being segregated, disarmed, disappeared, beaten, arrested, charged with trumped-up allegations, tortured, and killed. The evidence of this persecution is now a good deal stronger than it was in the mid-90s, as many more ZIPRA veterans have begun to tell their stories, not least in the work of Zenzele, who has interviewed so many people now, but also with the publication of some very substantial memoirs, Vincent's among them, but I think there are now over 10 published memoirs by former ZIPRA soldiers. Many hundreds of ZIPRA soldiers fled the ZNA, and ZIPRA demobilized at a far higher rate than their ZANLA counterparts in 1982 and 1983. The extent to which persecution was centrally coordinated isn't clear. Some battalions were much more badly affected than others. According to BMAT officers, some senior ZANLA figures wanted to undertake coordinated action against ZIPRA in the ZNA, and they want to claim credit for preventing that. I think that should be taken with a huge grain of salt since the BMAT instructors basically turned a blind eye to the pervasive persecution of Zebra at this time. Stuart Doran, Norma Krieger, Miles Tendy all give an account of a plan ultimately unimplemented to discharge all Zebra officers in one go in mid-1982. Pervasive persecution was such that senior figures, Tunga Marai, Nongo, and Jevin Maseko had to tour ZNA battalions to assure soldiers in October 1982 that, quote, they wouldn't be victimized for past affiliations. But they were, and they continued to be so, even if they demobilized or fled, especially if their home was in Matabeleland and Midlands. In July 1982, the abduction and murder of 6 foreign tourists in Matabeleland North led to a dramatic escalation of the security force presence, including battalions of the 1st and 2nd Brigades, police support units, the elite para group or parachute battalion, and the CIO. And I have more to say about the para group if anyone's interested. There's an interesting new article out about it. Zebra ex-combatants were targeted and detention camps were established in which Zebra soldiers were tortured and killed. Zebra soldiers who carried demobilization cards and who traveled to towns to get their pay were particularly vulnerable. Hundreds were also picked up in curfew and search operations in Bulawayo in mid-1982. Other Zebra soldiers serving in the ZNA in Matabeleland explained they had decided to desert at this moment when they were asked to participate in violent interrogations of civilians or fellow Zebra soldiers. I want to emphasize this is all in 1982. We haven't even got to the worst violence yet. So most of the Zebra who fled the ZNA in this period did not take up arms, but a significant number did. These dissidents were not the same as those of 1980. They were a product of the persecution of Zebra in and outside the ZNA, a condition which was made dramatically worse with the deployment of the 5th Brigade in January 1983. As is well known, this brigade was unique in its composition, orders, and practice, and it carried out a grotesquely violent campaign aimed overwhelmingly at civilians and justified in explicitly ethnic and political terms. Okay, so let me now focus on Zebra dissidents' stories as told to us in the mid-90s. The first point to make is that they claimed no political project. They described the process of taking up arms as the result of what they called, or what many of them termed, the situation, a shorthand for describing the mix of life-threatening pressures they faced without the benefit of their political or military leaders, who were by now in prison, marginalized, or under mortal threat themselves. They explained that their leaders had told them to accept the election result, to join the ZNA, and they had complied. Quote, but then here comes this situation knocking on our door. We never had intentions to lead this life. We'd done our duty. We wanted to build our homes. No one was recruited. We were forced by the situation. All of us just met in the bush, each person left on his own, running from death. The decision to look for others in the bush often followed multiple attempts to seek alternatives, hiding in Bulawayo, trying to reach South Africa, a stint in Dukwe refugee camp in Botswana. But curfew and search operations, the threat and realities of deportations, the difficulty in movement, and encounters with extreme state violence led to a decision to take up arms for many men. As one cadre explained, Zebra cadre explained, he had fled his ZNA battalion after serious fighting, tried to hide in Bulawayo, only to be very nearly picked up in a police operation, and then decided to go to his home in Chilocho, where he hoped he would be safe. He arrived at the same time as the 5th Brigade. When he got home, his mother told him that the 5th Brigade was looking for him and had already shot a neighbor's son who had recently returned from South Africa. He continued, and I'm going to read this quite long quote because I think it's important to really understand the extremity of this situation that people faced. So he says, my uncle was the first person killed by the Gukurahundi in my area. 9 members of my uncle's family were killed on one day in Nimani, Chilocho. This uncle of mine was killed at a school where everyone was gathered. They shot him in the toilet. They saw someone who was mentally disturbed from my uncle's home and shot him. Then they shot my elder uncle and his son. Some were just running away. Another uncle with his wife, having heard his brothers were killed, wanted to go to give condolences to the grandmother, and they ran into the Gugurahundi on the way, and they were all shot dead. So faced with this massacre, he thought of running to South Africa. Quote, "But if I was caught, they'd send me back. That day I didn't sleep at home. I decided that day to look for those people in the bush." Stories like that can be multiplied. They underlined that for these zebra soldiers, becoming a dissident, and I would say a quote unquote dissident, was perceived primarily as a way of protecting one's life. They felt abandoned by their leaders in an impossible situation. Often the decision to flee or demobilize was not initially a decision to take up arms again, only becoming one as other options disappeared. This is, of course, an almost total inversion of the contemporaneous ZANU-PF account of the origins of dissidents. Okay, so let me turn to how those zebra soldiers who took up arms again operated, which for many of them involved an assertion of their identity as quote unquote pure zebra, which is another really important part of their story. At first, they were scattered across a large area and did not have any clear sense of each other. They also described the confusion caused by the existence of Super ZAPU, the South African-backed group in late 1982 and 83. This group appears to have been largely recruited in Dukwi camp and in South Africa. It had some zebra men among it and appears to have been responsible for an upsurge in the killing of white farmers in that period. They were at first treated by other zebra soldiers as a potential source of much needed arms, but their behavior, according to a number of accounts, was not in keeping with zebra practices, notably in terms of the violent treatment of zebra cadres themselves. And when the alliance with South Africa became clear, a number of zebra men objected, owing to the long-standing and ongoing alliance with the ANC, and because they did not want, as some put it, quote unquote, to be UNITA. And of course, some of these zebra men were trained in Angola and had direct interactions with UNITA. So this was something that they very much rejected. These men stressed that their loyalties remained to Zebra and ZAPU. And in 1983, they organized against and fought with Super ZAPU groups, a move which sparked an effort to institute a territorial command. There are other reasons why Super ZAPU seems to have faded at this time, but the rejection of South African support by Zebra soldiers is important. According to these accounts, the command established in 1983 was loosely modeled on the 1970s Zebra, with northern, western, and southern regions, each with a commander, platoons, and sections, gathering points, and code words. But this was still a pale shadow of the original. These men probably never numbered over 300. Vincent said yesterday 200 to 250. And casualty rates and desertions were extremely high. Just 122 Zebra dissidents would turn themselves in under the 1988 amnesty. All regions had high turnovers in command and struggled to incorporate untrained people. With the rejection of South African support and crackdowns at Dukwi, there was no supplier of weaponry or secure place to which to retreat. Some described spending long periods with no ammunition at all, and all said they had to adopt a defensive strategy. Another major difference with the 1970s, commonly cited by the men we interviewed, was the lack of support from local ZAPU leaders and youth, a situation they explained as the result of the extreme repression party supporters faced and their inability to offer them any protection. As they admitted, their activities brought crackdowns in which civilians suffered. While the 5th Brigade was not considered a military threat by these men, it played an important role in creating a climate of terror, such that, as one put it, no one could support us. We took by force with a weapon. ZAPU leaders in Nkai and Lupane had had some initial sympathy for the terrible stories they heard from Zebra men who had taken up arms, but this sympathy had rapidly dissipated, and they blamed these men for a host of abuses. As I've noted, the Zebra men we interviewed often explicitly denied that they had had any political program beyond survival. This was not even a war against ZANU, but a war to defend ourselves against ZANU. The only way many of these men found of making sense of the quote situation was through the lens ZANU-PF had put on it, that is, tribalism. As one explained, Gukurahundi amounted to a kind of nullification of politics. Quote, a party constitution, ideology, a court of discipline, those weren't there. It was a tribal war. People had lost discipline and ideology. Life was desperate. People were confused. They had no line. They were only trying to survive by carrying a gun to protect their lives. Another explained that ZAPU had always fought against, quote, partyism, regionalism, racism, and tribalism. But in the 1980s, they were faced with a, quote, tribal war. ZANU-PF had, quote, injected people with the spirit of tribalism. And once one has that injection, the whole body becomes sick. ZIPRA had been multi-ethnic, but ZIPRA dissidents were endobelly. ZIPRA had operated in and been supported by others. But in the 80s, these areas had turned against them. Vestiges of ZIPRA remained, however. We can see the long history of the ANC alliance reflected in the eventual refusal of South African support. We can also see ZIPRA's proud understanding of itself as professional and disciplined, and how the ZIPRA men turned themselves in under the amnesty. They emphasized that this had been done after consultation among the regions and through planned surrenders at police stations. They also insisted that they retained their loyalty to their leaders, several stressing that they had come in because their leaders had asked them to. The rapid return to peace was in part owed to this ongoing...
Excuse me, Jocelyn, may we ask Mandla to mute him, Ta?
Yeah.
Ta is disturbing you. Mandla or Zenzele, please.
Okay, thank you. Is that muted?
Yes.
All right. Sorry. So I was just making the point that the people we interviewed had begun to understand this war as a tribal war, and that was another one of the stark differences between the 70s and the 80s. So if ZIPRA had once been multi-ethnic, ZIPRA dissidents were endobelly. If ZIPRA had operated in and been supported by Shona speakers, but in the 80s, these areas had turned against them. Vestiges of ZIPRA remained, however. We can see the long history of the ANC alliance reflected in the eventual refusal of South African support. We can also see ZIPRA's proud understanding of itself as professional and disciplined, and how the ZIPRA men turned themselves in under the amnesty. And this is actually reflected also in Vincent and Lova's account of how the group of men in the 1980s turned themselves into these ZIPRA regular forces. There's an emphasis on this kind of discipline and organization that identifies you as a ZIPRA soldier. The rapid return to peace was in part owed to this ongoing allegiance to ZAPU. But this peace made no amends for what had been lost. So one man explained the, quote, lasting effects on my life, which included lacking in education and being crippled, not only physically, but, quote, crippled permanently in society. The name dissident has had a psychological effect on me. Character-wise, the society thinks I am a killer, the worst enemy of society. And he felt also the suffering of others. Quote, when I look at the orphaned children whose fathers were abducted, I feel sad. Okay, so let me turn very briefly to the questions, or return very briefly to the questions of documentation and memorialization. The importance of documenting ZIPRA's dissident perspective lies in part in the way it subverts ZANU-PF's story of the dissident. In ZANU-PF's account, Gukurahundi is nation building, and the state violence of the 1980s is necessary and commensurate if Zimbabwe is to be ruled for Zimbabweans and not for the Ndebele. In the accounts of the men we interviewed, this was a conflict born primarily of the persecution of ZIPRA within and outside the ZNA, the life-threatening condition they referred to as the situation. They had not wanted to fight. They had no leaders. There was no purpose in fighting other than survival. ZANU-PF had reduced the politics of the liberation struggle to the confusion of tribalism. Being both Ndebele and ZIPRA meant that they could not escape ZANU-PF's definition of dissident. They stood already condemned by it. This was the opposite of nation building. it was an act of radical and violent exclusion. If we turn to memorialization, I think we can see the three cooperatives that former ZIPRA dissidents established after the amnesty as, among other things, an effort to remember. They were material and symbolic attempts to reclaim a place in society that had been lost. They were an attempt to insist that they could offer a better world, and specifically, they were an attempt to embody a model of development ZIPRA had lauded in 1980, but which lay in tatters in the post-unity ESAP era of the 1990s. The cooperative names are indicative of their ambition: Greenlight, Subantubanye. They did not, in the end, prosper, but their literal demise must not lead then to being forgotten. Okay, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, my network was jumping. I'm hopeful you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Jocelyn, for that presentation. I'm assuming you're done or you're continuing.
I'm done.
Missing some of the parts because. Okay, my connection was acting up, and I hope I can take this session. So people with questions, you can type the questions or lift your hand up if you're on Zoom, and if you're on Facebook, you can type questions. And it's quite interesting that you give the detailed descriptions of what happened, and also the interesting part that you talk about the early 1982, before the deployment of the Kukraund on the 20th of January 1983. Something was already happening. People were already being killed. Whilst we were waiting for people to ask, I have the question. You mentioned something about the paramilitary, or could you expand on that? Because I think it's either people confuse it with the 6th Brigade, which was also referred to the was it the Paras troop or the Parachute Brigade, led by Colonel Dyke. Because I remember having an argument with someone, and they were saying, no, the para was not there until 1986. Could you explain something about that?
Yeah, I partly threw that in there, hoping you would ask me about it, because there's a really interesting article that's forthcoming. I mean, it should be out, anytime now, that looks at what happened to the Black troops who served in the Rhodesian army. And why ZANU-PF incorporated them rather than rejecting them as sellouts, as they had often been labeled in the 1970s. So the Rhodesian African Rifles, which was predominantly Black with white officers, including Lionel Dyke, was acceptable as both liberation armies actually described it as a professional military force and therefore acceptable. But they said adamantly that irregular troops like the Selous Scouts and of course, the security force auxiliaries and Fumare Vanu and those kinds of groups were absolutely unacceptable and could not be incorporated into a post-independence military. And most authors, this is a paper by Mark Howard, I should say, and he's interviewed very many people in writing this history, Black soldiers of the Rhodesian army. And so many authors say the Selous Scouts were disbanded and were not made part of the new Zimbabwe National Army. And he says that's actually completely untrue. The Selous Scouts were incorporated into the Zimbabwe National Army. They were first, it was probably around 1,000 soldiers. About 800 of them were Black. Most of the white Selous Scouts left the country, went to South Africa, but the Black soldiers stayed. They were first incorporated into the RAR as 4th Battalion of the RAR and just rebadged, just given new hats, new uniforms, though they had never been part of the RAR. And then in September 1980, they were incorporated as the Zim Para Group, or what was called the Zim Para Battalion. And they were, and that's how they carried on in the Zimbabwe Army. So when Lionel Dyke is posted to Maribiland North in 1982, that para group is Sela scouts in part. So, you know, it's not, you know, there's an incredibly interesting history there, which tells you about who ZANU-PF was willing to ally with in order to make sure they had the military capacity to deal with ZIPRA. And the argument of Mark Howard's article is, you know, partly about that. It's like, you know, why would you take that decision to incorporate those people that had been so hated during the war into the Zimbabwe National Army? Yeah, so that's coming out soon. I can send you the reference.
I quite one thing that I've learned doing interviews with people, especially victims, is that a lot of guys who were former Rhodesian African Rifles, probably Selous Scouts, were very brutal during in the 50th Brigade, and mainly maybe because they wanted acceptance in the new system, that they were now loyal to the new government. It reminds me of one guy. I'm going to mention him because he's dead, so he can. Yeah, I now speak on his behalf. He was he go to the panning guy. People talk about a guy called something like a Miripiri, you know, Chilis, loosely translated, and his name I think was Pongweni. He won, when I tried to look for him, he won a number of awards in the African Rifles section around 79. He was given a medal. He was in the 50th Brigade, and I've talked to a number of ZIPRA guys who also talk about how he will, you know, hide, you know, like ZIPRA uniforms or something like that, and then, you know, say it's them who had hidden those uniforms. He was quite brutal. He killed people in Lupane until he became mentally disturbed because of the way he really did it. And there are quite a number. Some of them, I can't mention them because they're still alive, but there were a lot of guys who were in the African Rifles who were in the 5th Brigade, and they were quite brutal. And I guess your explanation of the paramilitary makes sense, and that's why we had a lot of pseudo operations, because the Selous Scouts were still very active. And yesterday, Hillary talked a lot about the Selous Scouts, and he has in other interviews that we've done mentioned his own experiences with them. So, guys, we can, if you have any questions, you can ask. I think we are not that many, so you can lift your hand, then I will unmute you. And yeah, I'll also be checking on Facebook for questions and comments. Yeah, Vincent, you can go ahead. I've asked you to unmute so you can speak.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with the issue that you have just talked about. I think there was confusion between paramilitary support unit, which is semi-military support unit, which was part of the police, and the parachute battalion, in which the Selous Scouts were housed. Exactly. I want to clear that.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Is the Selous Scouts went into, it was either called the para group or the paratroop battalion, but they were paratroopers. They were not support unit or police, and they were drawn from the Selous Scouts.
Right. Yeah. So the former Selous Scouts who remained in the army, what happened? Some former combatants, even from ZIPRA, were recruited to beef up the Selous Scouts.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I wanted to clear that.
Yeah.
Then there's something very interesting that arises here. ZIPRA as a force was disbanded in 1981. I want this point to be understood very clearly. So anything that happened after 81, as we have alluded to, that people were coming from different places, running away from persecution. I don't know why it continued to be said to be ZIPRA. As I said yesterday, these were individual survivors who were running away from persecution. ZIPRA had been disbanded in 1981. So the attachment of the word zebra to the survivors, to me, was part of that narrative to put zebra in a corner. Because as I said yesterday, that had nothing to do with zebra. Zebra had been disbanded. That's one. Secondly, I don't know why, if former zebra had deserted the army, why they should call themselves Super Zapu. Why not Super Zebra? This has nothing to do with Zapu. It's again the same narrative that was being cobbled. Why should they call themselves Super Zapu instead of Super Zebra? Because this has nothing to do with Zapu whatsoever. Two, I wanted these points to be clear, that Zebra was disbanded in 1981. Anything that happened after that, I don't see why there should be a prefix or suffix that mentions Zebra in that, unless there was a sinister agenda. These were individual survivors, full stop. Okay. The mention of there being Shona speaking people in the Zebra leadership, not only in the leadership, even in the ranks, we had a lot of Shona people. And in Zebra, I mean, it was an offense to even mention that somebody was Shona. We were just Zebra forces, full stop. Until the pretenders and opportunists came in to create this tribal mayhem. I wanted to clear that again. You see, even the movement of forces into urban cantonments, both in Chitungiza and in Tumbani, it was controversial because it was not agreed. The Zapu leadership was against that because they knew what would happen. But somebody or some people with an agenda went on to do that. And to me, it was the same agenda again to find ways to provoke Zebra into defense mode and then accuse them. I want to repeat that the movement of forces into the cantonments was never agreed upon. Some, especially Zapu leaders, disapproved of that. And they were accused of not caring about ex-combatants, which in itself really didn't make sense, because it was obvious that there were going to be fights. There's going to be a conflict. Okay. You know, there's something that is a mystery up to today that is repeated again and again and again. That during Ntumbane, forces from Gwai were stopped by the former Zebra leadership. I don't believe this. Let me tell you why. I don't think Zebra commanders at Gwai were so dumb that they could rally their forces to come to Ntumbane, leaving one, Gwai River Hotel, which was a center, a nerve center for communication, leaving the Victoria Falls Road open and working as usual, passing through Lupote police station, leaving it operating, and think they could reach Ntumbane without being scathed. I don't think they're so dumb. And this thing is a mystery because it is even the officer who is said to have stopped them and was overrun by a car. Nobody identifies that officer. Nobody has ever said anything about that officer. And when they were said to have been stopped, where did they go after that? So that's a mystery, or a creation again that was meant to tarnish Zebra. If there's anybody with evidence or anybody who has interviewed somebody who was in that unit, then I would agree that it is true. Otherwise, it's a myth.
Can I respond to some of your points? There are going to be too many.
Yes, please. Yes.
I think we should
I
have
was going to say, maybe we can stop and be here. You respond, because I have two, I think one question that you take up. I see we are 6:02. I'll ask for permission that we go up to about 6:15.
Okay, I really take your point about ZIPRA ceasing to exist once it's disbanded. And actually, it's a point that Jeremy Brickhill also made in his earlier presentation to another Cite event, that ZIPRA, doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist after that point of its being disbanded. What does continue to exist, however, is a powerful loyalty to the idea of ZIPRA and to the identity of being ZIPRA. So I think it's in that sense that ZIPRA lives on. And part of the argument I'm trying to make is that the way that this conflict plays out is powerfully shaped by those loyalties and identities. Why is there such a rejection of South African support? It's because of how people understand themselves in the context of the history of ZIPRA. So if you were trained in Angola, and part of what you did during that time was have some fights with UNITA, which happened, then of course you're going to have a particular attitude in the midst of this conflict towards South African support. So I think ZIPRA carries on in really important ways in shaping the way that people organize themselves, setting up command structures, how they communicate to each other, what they understand to be their politics. All of that continues to be shaped by the history of ZIPRA, if not literally being part of ZIPRA as an army. And I take your point absolutely on that point, but the identity and the influence on how people behave continues. And I think that's, if you don't take that into account, it's hard to explain how this conflict played out. The title Super ZAPU, I think, is a South African construct. It's an attempt to cast ZAPU in a bad light. This is part of a destabilization program. There's now quite a lot written about it, using access to South African archives, how the South Africans sought to construct this force, and it was on the model of Renamo. And of course, it's far less successful, and the reasons for that are interesting. And I've tried to explain some of that, but it's also the case that South Africa was involved in all kinds of destabilization work in this period. As we know, there were South African double agents in the CIO who fed information to ZANU about ZIPRA's arms caches, who tried to make ZIPRA look more threatening to ZANU. There were attacks on Nkomo barracks. There was an attack on the Thornhill base. There was an attempt to assassinate Mugabe. South Africa was doing all kinds of things, and Super ZAPU was one of its attempts to destabilize Zimbabwe. So I think the fact that it's called Super ZAPU just reflects a South African notion of what might be politically upsetting. That was the intention behind that. Vincent, I wish someone would write, something about Shona-speaking soldiers in ZIPRA, because they are so absolutely silenced in accounts of ZIPRA. I think that's a really important part of this history that's just kind of erased, partly because of, what's happened since independence and how that's affected where people are located and how they engage with veteran politics. But I take your point absolutely on that. I think it's a really important element of ZIPRA's history and one that needs to be brought out more. If we could have more interviews and oral histories with Shona-speaking ZIPRA veterans, that would be a fantastic contribution to this history. And also to the Mashonaland West area in which ZIPRA was operational. There's almost nothing written about those operations, except what's come out in kind of the Sunday news, interviews with people. There's a lot more to be said about that operational area as well, and how important it was at the end of the war. This question of why ZIPRA and ZANLA were moved into cities. ZANU overtly gave justifications that people were too bored in the rural APs, that they needed more comfortable living environment. One of the very explicit explanations for why ZANLA had to be moved into cities was from Edison Jobgo, who said, that they couldn't control them in the rural areas. There was this just crisis in the Northeast where Zanla was running rampant. They were doing, all kinds of attacks on people and ambushing vehicles and, all kinds of stuff. And they wanted to move Zanla into the cities in order to be able to control them better. That's what they said at the time. I think you're right. ZAPU did not think this was a good idea at all, and they were right. I think as soon as those troops came into urban areas, they started interacting with their followers, and that really complicated relations between them. So we'd have to work hard to reconstruct that decision-making process. Why I don't know. I would love to know more about that too. Hopefully we can find out more.
Yeah, on the issue of Shona speaking, Brickhill just commented that it was not only Shona speakers, but he also had colored and Asians, white. I remember Charles Gray. There's someone who also says, have you? I think he's referring to Cite. Have you interviewed, or maybe have you interviewed former Zipras from Mashonaland? My understanding is that there are some former Zipras from Mashonaland who were also persecuted. There's one Zipra guy from Mashonaland that I cannot mention now because I'm still trying to talk to him. He has an interesting story and he was up there. But also I learned that there was one guy who was a dissident in court who was from Mashonaland. He was from Murungwe. He operated in the Matopo area. And there was an incident where these guys made a mistake and they somehow they what do you call it, a bazooka, I think the bazooka, exploded on them and it blew the two of them at a certain homestead in Matopo. I think in one of our interviews, we actually talked to a guy, one of these guys who was there and he narrates, and he showed us the grave where this guy was buried. There were two of them. And this guy was actually from Murungwe. So that was the first incident to see someone who was Shona and part of the so-called dissidents. Then Brickhill has a question for you. He says, or maybe a comment, could you comment on the physical elimination of ZAPU and ZIPRA processes in Mashonaland West after 1980, specifically in the context of processing of continuation of elimination of ZAPU underground structures in Zanla operational areas during the liberation struggle?
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, I wish I could answer that question. I think it's something that needs to be researched. It's something that hasn't been written about, as far as I know, in any depth, except I've read one paper by someone at UZ who's been interviewing people in Hurungwe about those interactions. But I know, everybody who worked in rural areas, did research in rural areas in the late 80s, in all over rural Zimbabwe, would hear stories about how ZAPU had to be eliminated. ZAPU was there when Zanla arrived. And the first thing Zanla did was eliminate ZAPU. So, that was a very systematic policy for obvious reasons. They had to build their own support structures. So you're not going to work with ZAPU. So that continued in 1980 in the run-up to the elections, violently displacing ZAPU structures all over the country. And of course, they were all over the country. So that's, again, one of the histories that hasn't really been fully written. The focus of writing about violence in the 1980s is very much in Matabeleland. The vast majority of that writing is about what happens in Matabeleland, and that's for good reason. That's because the most extreme violence by far takes place there. But that is also just playing into the idea that ZANU-PF has, which is that ZAPU is only in Matabeleland. And if we ignore all the violence that takes place outside of that region, then we don't see how this is a national party that is being made into a regional party through violence. So I think that's a history which very much needs to be further explored. It's very hard to do at this point. So it would take some real sensitive on the ground interviewing, and I hope someone will be able to do that.
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes to go, and I'll I can't ignore William Jetrombo for doctor because he was going to say something interesting. So I'll give him a minute or two, then I'll come back to you to conclude. Jetro, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Ndebele, for doing the right thing of not ignoring me. Yeah, there is the other dimension. Listening to Prof today, to Prof Skanesia yesterday, and many other preceding conversations that you have platformed. One prominent issue that emerges without emerging is exactly how Zanla actually had its own dissidents. The latest account that can be referred to on that is Miles Dendy's book, where he records that, I think, if my memory serves me right, more than 3,000 Zanla cadres were commanded or commandeered not to report to the assembly points. And I think Prof. Alexander did refer to those that were campaigning at gunpoint for ZANU-PF in the first ever elections in Zimbabwe. These were, by any other name, dissidents, and no one knows when they were reintegrated into the army or not, which means that they were Zanla dissidents that were at large. What they were deployed to do, what reason they were supposed to do that for, nobody knows. It was something that was in the dark, but there were Zanla cadres that were not integrated into the mainstream Zimbabwean National Army. And that should worry anyone that is concerned about this subject. Because if they were armed men out there, commandeered by the ruling party and all that, what were they out there doing besides shooting down ZAPU supporters, including candidates in the first election that took place? That's another point of inquiry that needs to be looked at. Thank you, Zenzele. And sorry for the background noise. Where I am, there's a lot of noise at the back.
I have to say that thank you for that question, and it's a really important one. Vincent actually touched on it yesterday as well. There's actually a lot of documentation about those Zanla people who did not come into assembly points and who stayed in Mozambique or who stayed in Zimbabwe but outside assembly points. It's written about, as you say, in Miles Tendy's book, The Army and Politics in Zimbabwe, which is a biography of Solomon Mujuru, but it's about a lot more than that too. The other book, which writes quite a lot about it, is not read enough anymore. It's called Guerrilla Veterans by Norma Krieger. And that book is very interesting to read now, to go back and read it now, because she did a lot of interviews with people in the early 90s that would be absolutely impossible to do now. She's a foreign white woman researcher who sat in KG6 barracks interviewing serving officers in the ZNA about what happened in the 1980s. It would be impossible to do that research now. So if you read her book, it's actually fascinating because all of these senior military guys were willing to talk to her and tell them what their positions were. So you may not like the book for whatever reason, but it has incredibly interesting material in it that you cannot access now. It'd just be impossible to access it now, partly because a lot of people have died, but partly because the political situation has shifted and it's not possible to do those kinds of interviews. So I would recommend reading both of those. Fei Tung's book, lots of books actually deal with that period and what Zanla was attempting to do by keeping soldiers outside of assembly points or outside of the country. They were insurance and they were supposed to do political mobilization, and I think they were pretty effective at it.
I'm muted. Okay, sorry about that. I was saying, Vincent, I'm going to give you a minute, then I'm going to come to Jocelyn to close.
It's just something on the killing of the white farmers and something to think about all the panelists and people who are here. you realize that even after the amnesty was declared and the survivors came back, white farmers continues being killed up to the 2000. So, which means there was somebody who was killing the white farmers. That's what I wanted to put across, and you can research and find out white farmers continue to being killed even after the amnesty, even after 1988. Thank you.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point, because I was reading a book, it's a paper written by a guy at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he talks about white farmers being killed in Mashonaland immediately after independence, way before the history. The guy, I'll post the paper online, I forget but I found it quite interesting the way he frames it. Anyway, it's 6:17. We have gone 17 minutes after our time, and I always value keeping our time, so that next time when we invite our guests, they know that we can keep time. So at this point, I'll ask Professor Jocelyn to give us her closing remarks.
Thank you, Zanzelia. I don't want to keep people any longer either. I just want to say how grateful I am for this opportunity to talk to this audience, and how much I appreciate the work that you are doing in documenting this history, and the films that you are making, which are incredibly important as a record of the 1980s. So I just want to say more power to you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And thanks to everyone who's attended. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing us to share with this platform with you, and also benefiting from your knowledge. Someone described you as a moving encyclopedia on this subject, and after the presentation, I totally agree with you. And I've always consulted anyway in many issues when we're dealing with this work, and your knowledge of the subject is quite vast. And thank you for allowing us to be with you today, and agreeing to present this lecture. To everyone who has attended, and to the guys who have attended all lectures, we are so grateful for your support, and keep sharing the videos. They are online. And the festival continues tomorrow with one last event, which is a surprise event. And we'll talk about it when it has happened somewhere in the streets of Matebeleland. So for those who are watching on Facebook, thank you for following and keep sharing. My name is Zenzele. Till we meet again in other programs, have a good night.